Mhm.
Oh,
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls,
we're
children of all
live.
ages, welcome to A Moral Action. I am your host, Jeffrey Joseph, your friendly neighborhood youth minister, and with me today is my good friend and colleague, Joe the Vatican Assassin Lemmy. Welcome to the pod, Joe.
What's up, Jeff? I got my Powerade ready to talk about sports and go through all of this by the end of the pod, if it's
I,
possible.
I kind of wish they would sponsor us now because you've obviously broadcast how much you love Powerade. Powerade is
Is that
kind
not
of
allowed? Can I not do that?
You just did it. There's no allowed or disallowed. I'm just saying I
All
hope
right.
we get paid one day by Powerade because we have
Okay.
so obviously advertised for them. Between you and Derek Rose, they have an unassailable campaign, is what I'm saying. Joe Lemmy endorses. You guys both play about the same amount of basketball these days anyway. But we'll
We
get into
do, yeah,
we'll
yeah,
get
we
into
do,
that
we
later.
do.
Uh,
I don't really bowl too much these days.
I mean, right, exactly. So there you go. As we established on our last pod, a lot of what we talk about is evaluating the morality of different situations. Today, we have for you a special sports themed podcast because Joe and I are very in tune with a lot of sports going on. And I guess we'll start out, though, first with talking a little bit about you, Joe. You want to tell the crew a little bit about you, where you're from, how you root for all those reviled Boston franchises, all those things. Go ahead.
I'm from Massachusetts. I grew up about 2 hours outside of Boston. Lived in Boston for about 3 years now. Spent a year in Korea. The sports scene in Korea really wasn't that amazing at all. They had a couple baseball teams, and like MMA was really big for some reason too. And then yeah, like my all-time favorite player when I was a kid was John Elway. I was a big Broncos fan. He retired and went to do like beer commercials, and then I got into the whole Patriots and Red Sox and Celtics thing more. And like my dad and I, like we usually bond a lot over the Celtics, so that's a big reason I'm a fan of them.
Sure.
I'm not a fan of the Patriots just because they win, but winning does help. And then the Red Sox are just the Red Sox, and I don't really follow hockey too much. I was a big tennis player when I was in high school, so I watched a lot of pro tennis, a lot of college sports too, and also I do a lot of work with international students. And like the three things I can never explain to them about America is healthcare, guns, and American football are the three things that no matter how much I try talking them up, they just don't understand it. And I don't understand non-American football, like your European, like soccer, I suppose we should say. Like, I don't get that. So we're kind of even. They tell me all these cool things about soccer, and I tell them all this cool stuff about football. And at the end of the day, we just don't understand each other. So that's that, I guess. Maybe this pod can help them with that if we get to football.
I think if we talk about football at all, it'll probably not be in a glowing light. So it'll be just like soccer, which means they should learn to love it. Exactly. So,
I guess so. It's the whole clock go understand. Like if they only made the clock go down instead of up in soccer,
mhm.
it would just make the sport so much better. So let's get on that. Whoever the soccer, if there's any soccer officials watching this pod, make the clock go down. Stop making it go up. I don't understand that.
First of all, I think you have to be at least a billionaire to influence soccer. I think there are billionaires that influence soccer on a regular basis. I think that's been made very clear. But even with the 2 cents from Powerade, you might get in a year from advertising for them, which would have basically just been for free on this pod. I don't think you have enough. Also,
I
if
gotta take the label off. I gotta take the label off.
I'm just saying you can leave
Gross.
the label on. It's fine.
Uh,
Also, I have to ask a follow-up question about John Elway. If he stopped making beer commercials and made Powerade commercials, would you still be a Broncos fan?
no, no, I don't think I would be
Well, that's
because
disappointing. I don't
they
think that's
have
his.
Peyton Manning now, and I'm not a fan of Peyton Manning. I wasn't a fan of Tim Tebow. I was a fan of Tim Tebow for about a year, and then that went away. So no, maybe if he advertised like better beer than what he does, then that might change things.
It's all about getting paid. It's not
That's
like
what
he's got enough
that's what
money
has
from
to
winning two
happen.
Super Bowls.
That's what
Come
has to
on.
happen.
Well, speaking of getting paid, the first thing that I wanted to talk to you about was, of course, we
Yeah.
just got through the NCAA March Madness. It is over. We have Duke crowned champions. And so I have to ask you, do you think that these athletes should get paid in college? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
I think it has to happen in some way. I mean, they always say like the college education is the greatest form of payment, and I definitely think there's truth to that. But I mean, when you have a basketball game at the Lucas Oil Stadium in Indianapolis, and you have your coaches and you have the chairman of the NCAA, influencing politics, with the whole religious freedom law thing that passed in Indiana, and like you can't turn your eyes off of March Madness. Every time you look at March Madness, there's a sponsor. You got all the commercials and Coke and Spalding, and you have the Wisconsin player who had like 8 million hits on YouTube because he called a female interviewer beautiful under his breath or something, and like that went viral. So there's got it. I felt a little guilty and a little say watching the tournament this year because I was just so much more aware of just all the sponsorship and like just having a basketball game in a gigantic brand new football stadium. There's something about that I think eventually there's going to be some form of payment system or like make them go to all 4 years of college. Like do something where there's just less money involved with this from a business standpoint. And you have schools out there that regardless of the endorsements, if they're paying coaches like in the millions, yeah, I'd like to see that distributed more amongst the players than it actually is. So I think the day is coming where somehow there's going to have to be some sort of payment scale, and like the top tier programs obviously can pay more than like D3 or D2 schools, and like that's a huge thing to try to negotiate and figure out what the best way of doing that is. But it's just there's too much sponsorship involved, and it's so big on such an international scale that those kids got to get something out of that more than just a year of college if they're all going to be one and dones like the trend is becoming nowadays.
Right, and that's part of the problem is that they're recruiting these one and done players who to go into the
Mm-hmm.
NBA, which is not even an NCAA rule. It's actually an NBA rule, but it
Right.
affects the NCAA, and so they just have to recruit the best players they can find and hope they can get them to a championship within a year. So even
Yeah.
institutions that might otherwise actually be considered great academic institutions, like for example Duke, they go after these players that they have every intention of only having for a year, and then they cycle them out and get the newest, best thing and see how that goes. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
of course, the way that the game played out, Duke ended up winning, which in it, they basically were the one and dones against the students who actually graduate.
Right.
And that was some of what the coach Bo Ryan talked about after the game was, it's one and dones and things like that. But he also complained about officiating, which there were definitely some questionable calls throughout the game.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly in the second half
Sorry.
against Wisconsin. In the first half, I think the foul calls were almost reflective of each other. Right, the first half Wisconsin got all the calls, and the second half Duke got all the calls.
Mm-hmm.
Of
Mm-hmm.
course, if
I think that's fair to say.
you're only going to get calls for the half, you probably want it to be the second half, not the first. But
That would be good, yeah. That's what I want all my calls coming.
right, exactly. But yeah, this NCAA stuff, they do have so much in the way of scholarships that they do give to these students in terms of an education, but they don't ever actually intend for them to attain that education.
100%, right. And I mean, like the amount of publicity that a school like Duke gets from the NCAA and like that association in everyone's mind. I mean, that I think that speaks volumes for what these students need to be getting from all of this, from this big experience. I mean, the option's always there. Like the Moutier's, Emmanuel Moutier this year, like going to play in China, just like making your money and going pro right away. I mean, they don't have to go to college if basketball is what they really want to do, but got to get paid somehow, I think.
Well, yeah, but so far they've been incentivized to go ahead and go to these colleges because it gives them a better track into the pros, right? People don't really respect the Chinese game where Emmanuel Mudiay went to, or
Right.
Brandon
Stephon
Jennings was
Marbury.
overseas. Stephon Marbury's over there now in China as well. And Stephon Marbury, who's been like too slow and not really athletic enough to be in the NBA for the last 5 years, has won a championship or two or three. I don't even know at this point how many in China, just because
It's like
that's the
all of
level of
them.
competition, right? He just keeps winning
He's
all of the
every
championships.
championship. Just give it to him.
Well, now
That's all
that he's got a musical based on his life in China, why not? He might as well win all the championships. He's winning
Exactly.
life.
Exactly.
They're
I might go to
measuring.
China. I want my own musical. I want a musical about my life.
I'm sure it would be
Can't
just
get
as
that in the
magical.
U.S. I can't do it in the United States. I have to go to China for that to happen.
You're right. There are too many white guys in the U.S., but a white guy in China, you never know.
That's musical worthy right there.
Exactly. So what I was going to ask you about this, and it's something that I've been thinking about for a little while now, is with the NCAA, what if, because even the NCAA president makes millions of dollars, the coach makes millions of dollars.
It's a lot of money.
I should say the NCAA president, who's in charge of an organization that cannot even really police these athletics, because
Can't do it.
even when they say that athletes shouldn't get paid, and Johnny Manziel clearly did get paid, what happens to him? He misses a half game, but he'll be in there for the second half when it matters. Or with everything that's happened with Jameis Winston, he steals some crab legs. You know what? I know his number one sport is football, but we're going to make sure he misses a couple innings of baseball, and that'll be
Right.
all the punishment that we'll dole out for him, because we make too much money off of him playing ball, even though he
Right.
makes none. So I was thinking, because addressing a lot of things, one, the one and done culture, this idea that these players are coming to these academic institutions and flagrantly having no interest in the academic part of the academic institutions, but also the programs not really interested in them as students. They're just a farm system for professional leagues.
Right.
Why not start a system where, if you're going to keep something like the one and done rule in the NBA, why not force the students to make a decision? If they want to stay for only a year, then that's fine. But whatever they would have gotten in scholarships from that year, they have to pay it out of their tuition, or not out of their tuition, out of their first contract, their rookie contract.
Okay.
So if they're going to be multimillionaires anyway, what do they care? Let them pay the $50,000 from that year, or however much you want to make it.
Right. Right. Right.
But if they stay through to graduation and actually graduate with a degree, then that scholarship is totally valid. They've stayed their full years. They have not only the benefit of the scholarship from the 4 years, but also a degree, because really we should be trying to motivate them as students to learn enough to actually earn a degree, to actually be able to do something in life outside of being athletic, because everybody loses their athleticism at some point.
Hmm.
Even Floyd Mayweather is going to have to be out of the ring at some point. He can't win every fight forever,
Right. 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 Right.
even so far as he picks and chooses who he's going to fight, as he is so skillfully done. But what do you think? What do you think about this idea for a solution for the one and done era as a farce, as it pretty much is right now?
I think injury is always such a problem with that, though. Like making a call, like making my own decision on, starting senior year in September and then having June so far away and deciding, like, do I get a job? Do I go to grad school? Like, there's just so much that can happen during the year. So I think the timing of that choice is, most important if that ever becomes a system. Or just like maybe, find some way of packaging classes so it's like a 2-year associate's degree that they like absolutely have to get instead of a 1-year deal, or make them commit to all four. Like make them just say, you came into college, like you're going to Duke, you're gonna get a 4-year education at one of the best universities in the country. Like we're doing you a solid. Like not everybody's gonna go on to be the next great NBA star. You look at Jabari Parker, like this year, just totally sitting out in Milwaukee, got hurt. You look at people playing for the Timberwolves now and all the rookies they got up there who, being successful athletes is not really ever going to happen if they're in that organization, or the Celtics, like the athletes they got, all the rookies they got on their team currently. So I think, the timing of that choice is going to be key. And then also, if you're going to go a struggling franchise, and you get injured and you have to sit out a year, it might be nice to actually have some education to fall back on and do something with that injured year. So I'd much more favor just like an associate's program for them, or make them commit to a whole 4-year thing, and then that way the NBA won't be all these like 18, 19-year-old kids running around, and you're getting like the Marcus Smart situation where he's low blowing people in the groin. And is that because of youth or just because of who he is? Or like watching LeBron like going through the growing pains he went through when he first got into the league too. Yeah, I don't really think these rookies right out of the gate, DeMarcus Cousins or John Wall, like they're not immediately successful individuals or really strong character guys sometimes on these teams. Like it takes them a while to get into their own skin in the NBA, and I think staying for 4 years would help improve the NBA game a lot too.
Sure. And actually, this brings up another point that I want to talk to you about is referencing something that Gino Auriemma said last week, which was that the NCAA men's tournament and really NCAA men's college basketball is a joke because they have the lowest scoring averages that they've had since the 1950s. That they don't even really know how to play real basketball. They have the 35-second shot clock, which no other
right, yeah,
in the world
exactly.
has.
Yeah.
Deliberately waiting it out and having a low-scoring game.
Mm-hmm.
And look, as really a terrible athlete myself, of course I love defense because it involves generally less skill. It's mostly just about hustle in the NBA and the NFL, what have you, just playing anywhere. So I'm a big fan of defense. Plus, I root for the Chicago Bears, and how often have we really had a worthy starting quarterback? But that's besides the point. Point being, defense is great, and I love defense. But I think it says more about the league that they are having the lowest scoring totals in the last 60 years. That probably suggests that the one and done era, at least it seems, and it may be because of the one and done era, it may be because of other factors. But for some reason, the product that is the NCAA college basketball tournament for the men has been pretty bad. That UConn, the women's team, scores way more on average. I think 20 points more on average than the average men's basketball team. So do you think that's a result of the one and done era? Do you think that's because they just aren't learning how to play basketball in a way that even translates to other basketball around the world? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's difficult to build that cohesion and to build the team effort when everybody's just there for 1 year. And also just watching a college basketball game on them can be such a chore. There's just so many timeouts and possessions can go on forever. So I think they're connected in some way. Yeah, I mean, I wonder too if like having that 35-second clock is meant to draw out the game more than the NBA and make it go slower to like get more from television and sponsors and just making the game last a longer time. But I think it's valid. Yeah, it's definitely a valid criticism.
I think a follow-up question then would be for me is I just watched my cousin in the 5th grade and she's playing a basketball game and they have it in quarters. If they wanted more timeouts, why don't they just do quarters instead of halves? Nobody else in the world plays by a half.
There's a lot to change, yeah. There's a lot to change about the game and like 3-point shots too. I mean, that's another thing to bring up. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot to redo, and wondering how like a total makeover of the game would affect their TV endorsements and sponsors and all of that too. There's a lot to think about there. There really is.
Yeah, I think, and I think you referenced this a little bit earlier with the NCAA addressing the Indiana legislation that essentially seemed to promote discrimination primarily against same-sex couples. But sports seem to have clearly taken a central role in television in a way that could not have been conceivable 30 years ago when ESPN
absolutely
was just
not.
starting.
Yeah, right, of course.
Especially because in the era of DVR, the only thing that people bother to watch live is a sporting event.
Yeah, totally, right.
If you don't watch it live, there's no point on watching it.
No reason to.
Right, so that probably says something about the merit of the game itself, that it totally loses its value immediately after it's done. But
absolutely.
We all still tune in and watch.
Right.
So, given that position, why aren't they trying to be more experimental, especially in the NCAA? It's not like okay, you have a 35-second shot clock. Would the NCAA ever consider having a 9-foot hoop? That doesn't seem likely. I mean, it's a 10-foot hoop in high school. It's a 10-foot hoop in the pros. Why wouldn't they just have a regular shot clock? Now, high schools also don't have a shot clock in many states, and that seems like a problem that could be relatively easily fixed. But I have not watched AAU games, but I would imagine that AAU games are at least tempoed in such a way that a shot clock would not be detrimental to them.
Right.
But also, do you think that the AAU mentality of having all of the best players play together on these super teams, do you think that has affected the NCAA game at all, and ultimately then affected the NBA because they transitioned to the NBA not long after being in college?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think there definitely is an effect. I mean, you see all the super teams now, like how that's becoming a trend in the NBA, and how, the Atlanta Hawks, everyone's so surprised that at their record, but like no one gives them a shot at all to, make it out of the first round. Sometimes it seems like so. They're definitely connected. I think all of that it starts at the beginning, and then people just work their way up from there. It's a serious issue.
All right, we're gonna move on.
I really don't know too much. I don't know too much about that. I wasn't prepared. I didn't do my homework.
How dare you, Joe? How dare you?
I just got on the Google Hangout at like 4:45. So let's just talk. Let's just see what happens. Be basketball and stuff. I don't know.
Fair enough. Then we're gonna move on, but we're not gonna move on to professional NBA. Let's first talk about what I think is more interesting because it has become the national pastime, and that is the National Football League.
There we go.
How many different controversies can we point to? The champions
There's so many.
Are the Patriots, who I always affectionately refer to as the Cheatriots because, well, hey man.
Strong words.
Deflategate. Deflategate. All I can say is,
strong words.
According to reports, leading up to the championship game, apparently they had 11 out of 12 balls that were underinflated. I don't know how that affects the football game, but apparently it was against the rules is another thing.
There's no way Indy's winning that game. There is no way they're winning that game.
I agree. It seemed highly unlikely. They were doing better with the underinflated balls in the first half than in the second half.
Totally, absolutely.
But nonetheless, that was like the big controversy going up to the Super Bowl, right?
Right.
But it's like the 50th most important thing going on in the NFL right now. You have
There's a lot going on.
The concussion lawsuits and the NFL, even though they have actually acknowledged, Greg Aiello, the NFL spokesman, did acknowledge that there was obviously a link between playing football and chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And for those of you listening who don't know what that is, just look up CTE and you'll find out exactly what that is. Or you could watch the ESPN and PBS co-produced League of Denial documentary, which aired on PBS and was sort of pushed aside by ESPN because coincidentally, this documentary that shows all of the terrible things that the NFL has done to escape any kind of culpability when it comes to CTE and all of those things related to it, the ESPN happens to broadcast every day. They've got NFL Insiders and NFL Live, and every Monday night during the season they're going to have their Monday Night Football game. So, of course, they don't want to endanger their relationship that blatantly with the NFL.
You got to wait until Christmas time. Will Smith is making a movie about it, too. So that'll take care of everything.
Well, I suspect that his Scientology perspective on the NFL will greatly enhance the conversation in the United States.
He's a Scientologist?
He hangs out with a lot of Scientologists.
I have no idea.
That movie After Earth that came out with his son, I think that had a lot of Scientologist undertones, and besides being just an awful movie, apparently. But that's a thing. But anyways, so you've got the concussion lawsuits. You've got Ray Rice, who, of course, beat his wife and got a 2-game suspension because that seemed totally appropriate for knocking your wife out in an elevator and then callously dragging her across the room. You've got Greg Hardy, who just signed with the Dallas Cowboys for like $12 million, I believe, is the full extent of his contract. He had been on the commissioner's exempt list last year, which just meant that he got paid to not play football for the entire year, which seems like a pretty good deal, who was convicted of beating the snot out of his girlfriend. Not to make light of the situation, he was apparently, according to documents, court documents dragging her around by her hair and threatening to kill her, throwing her on top of a bed of loaded weapons and things like that. And the only reason why he isn't in prison right now is because in Carolina, North Carolina, he has the option of going to a jury trial even after convicted. And so he went to the jury trial, and before the case got to the jury trial, he apparently paid her off so that she would not appear in trial.
Right.
And then on top of that, you have the Washington National Football professional team, whose name or nickname is pretty evidently a racial slur, which is why I have to refer to them as the Washington Professional Football Team rather than what they refer to themselves as. So what do you think it says about us as a country, maybe as a sports watching people, that we have all of this controversy circling around the number one sports league in our nation, and yet we still watch?
Right. Well, it's barbaric. I mean, it really is. And there are plenty of football players out there who don't get involved in any of this stuff. And football can be a great game to teach discipline and teamwork, and just to motivate people into being better human beings on many different levels. But I mean, when we have like these gladiators every Sunday running full speed at each other, and there's the violence of the game, it's going to lead to some negative consequences. And I think that, being in Korea last year, where like football just wasn't even thought about, I think there's some wisdom behind sort of their culture where just like, size, like just getting that large and doing that sort of thing for sport just really doesn't make sense or click for them. But then you also have MMA and boxing, where you have people even bigger than some of the football players, and they're not getting into nearly as many as the misadventures of the NFL this year. So I think greater transparency from the league is obviously really important. And, is there a link? I mean, is there a link between football and like getting that beat up Sunday after Sunday and some of the violence and, stuff that we've seen in the past football season? Because like boxers, MMA people, they don't fight. They're not going at it every single week. And I think to have a game Sunday after Sunday and then think about expanding the preseason and, making the playoffs longer, I think stuff like that is sort of unreasonable given how much violence is associated with the league. And it's like not a discipline sense of violence that you get in like the
Did we lose Joe? Where'd he go?
fighting sport always running on the field. I'm here.
Oh, okay. It froze for a second there.
I haven't gone away. I'm still around.
Well,
Still around.
you spoke to, among many things, you refer to them specifically as gladiators, which I think is the particularly appropriate comparison because, of course, the gladiators in combat in ancient Rome, they did work very intentionally as a political tool to pacify the masses. What do they have to worry about if they've got a good fight in front of them and they can be entertained and the emperors would arrange for them to have some food distributed at these events as well for free, so they'd get a little bit of bread, they'd get to watch them fight, and it was an overall entertaining day, and then they don't have to worry about the more important things that are circling around this, like the fact that you're basically just watching people get murdered for all intents and purposes.
Kind of, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So do you think that given the culture of the NFL as it is today, and you referenced a little bit of what some would say the hubris of the NFL, that they want to expand the playoffs or add more regular season games, maybe potentially at the cost of preseason games, but they'd really like to have all of it. Do you think there is a chance that as the owner, Mark Cuban of the Dallas Cowboys, or not Dallas Cowboys, the Dallas Mavericks, has said that the NFL is like the fatted pig that is primed for slaughter, that it will ultimately fold in on itself and somehow diminish over the years when we maybe reflect on it more critically, or do you think it's just going to keep growing?
It's just going to keep growing. It's not going anywhere. There's no way the NFL is going anywhere. And like one bad year like they had this year that's not going to change anything. it's just not going away. There's no way it's going away. It's like such a part of United States and American traditions, and like it's just such an American game that it's not gonna go anywhere. What I do hope happens is that if anything, all this attention the league has gotten from domestic violence issues this past year, that it raises more awareness for things like that, and raises more awareness of concussions and like athletes who maybe hide injuries and still compete anyways. Like, hopefully they can use all that publicity they get for good and like actually affecting some social change. Which may or may not happen, but I think that's really that all can be hoped for, because it's not. I mean, it's not dying in any way. The Thursday night football. I mean, like how insane was that? And the games were so terrible, and they're already talking about doing it again next year. Like during the basketball tournament a few weeks ago, like they were advertising Thursday night football. Like, and I'm sure millions of Americans, myself included, there's a smile on the face when that comes up, because it just makes us think about fall and Sundays and beer and pizza and America and like in no better sense of anybody's sense of the word. So yeah, like I would like to see from them more of responsibility as an organization, though, to get out there and promote. Not all their players are total always getting into trouble like that, and those cases are specific incidents that need to be reflected on, and if they're so in society, it needs to be used more for good and raising awareness more than anything else.
Well, I would hope for all those things to happen, and if I were more of an optimist, perhaps I would believe that those things would happen. But in terms of trying to focus on players who are doing good things, I believe, and you can check me on this, but I'm pretty certain that Greg Hardy, when he was arrested for having brutally beaten up his girlfriend, it was when he was attending a domestic violence awareness seminar of some kind. So he was at an event that was trying to promote awareness of domestic violence and obviously, in theory, prevent domestic violence. And yet he obviously is one of the most egregious offenders in terms of committing domestic violence himself.
Sure.
And then also, as far as concussion awareness, I think it has increased regardless of what the NFL has tried to do to diminish its impact on the game. And I think perhaps the most telling example of this was, and I'm sure you've seen images of this because you watched the Super Bowl like I watched the Super Bowl, and everybody did. And everybody saw what happened to Julian Edelman in the fourth quarter, and he went down. And everybody in the room that was with me said, that man has a concussion. They have to take him out of the game. And he absolutely did not come out of the game.
Right.
And I understand from a player's perspective, this is it. This is my whole season. I need to stick it out. But who's going to be there? Who's going to be the influence, if not the NFL as a governing body, to say, hey, somebody needs to get that guy out of the game. Anybody watching this on TV can tell he's having a concussion right now.
Right.
And sports are great, and they're fun, and they're entertaining, but they're not more important than him being able to have short-term or long-term memory in 10 years or something.
No, and it comes from within. I mean, I once went to an oral final in graduate school when I was like trying to choke down puke and had an incredibly bad stomach ache, but I wanted to get an A on that final, and I almost projectile vomited all over the professor, and no one was there to say, Joe, you shouldn't go to that final at the moment. So, I think they do need internal police and people to monitor things a lot better than they actually do. Like that absolutely has to happen. I think they just need it. They need better internal responsibility, and hopefully, the more these stories are reported on, the more the NFL realizes they have a lot of stuff they need to get done.
Sure. I will ask also. I've sort of made my opinions on it clear because I refuse to use your name. But what are your thoughts on the controversy surrounding the Washington professional football team, whose name I choose not to say because I think it's a racial slur? But the owner of the team, Dan Snyder, contends otherwise.
Yeah.
And he, in fact, has at least a couple of Native American organizations who support him. Although I believe last week it was revealed through Deadspin that one of the women who was a Native American chief who supported Dan Snyder has recently been impeached because she had been receiving gifts from Dan Snyder. Surprise, surprise, a woman who happens to be in support of what many see as a racial slur against her own people has been receiving gifts from the man that she was supporting.
Mm-hmm.
But do you have any thoughts on that and how that plays out here in the U.S. and potentially how that would play for the rest of the world, looking at the U.S. as the beacon of, I don't know what authority we still have as a nation, but
Right.
people
No,
still look to the U.S.
it's
that
got to
way.
change. And like what I really wish I had seen the previous season is that all broadcasters would have banded together and refused to use the name. It's got to take unity because again, it's something that has been there for years. I mean, they've always been known by that name. And unless there's an organized front to improve it, I don't think it's going to change. Plus, the Redskins, they need to start winning games. I mean, they need to be a relevant franchise, and like as soon as they're relevant again, like that's going to give them more pressure to change. But as long as they're in the bottom of the NFC East, I mean, it's not going to have as powerful of an impact as if they're at the top. But there needs to be unity among, I think, the broadcasters and people who go to the Washington games, and then as soon as the Washington team, as soon as they start getting more wins, and if RG3 becomes what we thought he would be, then that will lead things in the right direction. But I don't really think too many people recognize it when they keep losing and they're never really on like the prime time games. Like they're almost never on Sunday Night Football, Monday Night Football maybe, but it's like a throwaway game at the end of the season. So they need to be more. They need to get better before I think anything happens with the name, really. But that'll bring greater national attention to them.
See, I actually think the opposite is true. I think the more they get successful, assuming that they ever do, that the more they'll only be emboldened because there's so much of a mentality that might makes right. That, well, whatever happens doesn't really matter off the field or off the court, whatever the sport may be, because they're winning. And there seems to be, this prize of winning trumps everything, right? Leading up to the Super Bowl with the Baltimore Ravens, there was all this controversy about Ray Lewis, who had probably taken a banned substance, although there are some disputes about whether or not he was actually tested positively for that. But it was pretty apparent that he had been taking deer antler spray, which at the time was a banned substance. But nobody really cared because he could only be suspended for it after the game. And then the Baltimore Ravens won the Super Bowl, and then nobody cared anymore because they won. So why would that not be the same case if the Washington professional football team, if they started winning and they won a Super Bowl, would that not just make them all the further emboldened to say, hey, look, we have fans everywhere, we're winners, we won everything. Everything that we did up to this point is fine.
I would go with the opposite still being true, because like all the controversy came up this year in one of their off years when like there was no reason to care at all about what they were doing. So if that national profile increased, then you're going to have more fans thinking about what exactly are we talking about. So I don't know. Like they need somebody to take over that franchise somehow. There's so much going on in Washington. It's difficult to say because they're just not good and they don't really show any signs of improving.
Right, and I guess a potential test case in another league to transition us to that other league would be in the NBA.
Well, the Bullets, right? The Bullets changing to the Wizards. Like I forget how that happened, but I mean that's just.
It wasn't because they were successful. I could tell you.
That's for damn sure. Yeah, it wasn't. But again, I don't know if it was like years of just what are we saying, what are we doing, like. Maybe that'll happen. The Redskins can keep losing, and maybe eventually more sportscasters and people will band together and be like, this is really not that great of a name for a sports team.
Right. But again, I'd refer back to the fact that ESPN, for example, did not want to alienate the golden goose when it came to doing the reporting for League of Denial. And if potentially doing a report on or repeatedly making an issue of it by not referring to them by their nickname might endanger their relationship with the NFL, why would they choose to do it? Now,
It could. It totally could happen that way, yeah.
They have had broadcasters, a number of them, broadcasters you and I listened to, from Bill Simmons and on forward, who refuse to refer to them as anything other than the Washington national football team or professional football team.
Right.
Robert Flores, who does the NFL Today or another daily NFL podcast, he also does not refer to them by any name other than a very generic Washington professional football team. But what I was going to say was, do we just have a limited frame of reference for this, or do we not have context enough to be able to say that this is a racist name, or is it also partly because we just don't have the attention span for this sort of thing? When it came to, for example, Donald Sterling in the NBA, which is where I was going to go earlier, the Bullets absolutely did change their name. The LA Clippers did not change their name. They did have their owner kicked out.
Right.
For saying some pretty terrible things.
Right.
But as Bomani Jones, I believe, wrote about years ago, him saying terrible things was not nearly as bad as all of the terrible things he did as a real estate mogul, including having people like his wife, Shelley Sterling, go door to door to investigate to see if there were Asian Americans living in their homes. And now, if you had paid enough attention, if you had the attention span to listen to all of that conversation, you would say, how is it that Shelley Sterling, after all of this, is still allowed to go to every single LA Clippers game, aside from the billions of dollars that her and her still husband, I believe, Donald Sterling, made from selling the Clippers? And I can only guess it's because we have such a limited attention span, and even though something was done, not enough was done. But to your point, maybe part of that was because the LA Clippers are finally not a team that's just there to make money. They actually have had some success, although
right.
Limited playoffs.
That's true. Limited, but they have a higher profile now than the Lakers do, and they have more star power than CP3 and Blake. I think might be more star power than Kobe nowadays, at least in the U.S., like not in the international market. So
right.
Yeah, and it was during the playoffs too. Like it was in playoff season, so I think that also had something to do with it. And that was just like a collective, like, who is this guy and what is he doing? And I don't think the Redskins stuff has become collective yet. And I think that, that could also tie into like how we treat Native Americans in this country.
Sure.
As well. I wonder if that has something to do with this, where, Redskins offensive, but how many people really know somebody who would be in?
Yeah, and actually, in reference to that, I would say there's been some question recently because of the Indiana legislation, which we've already referred to. There's been some criticism, some backlash against the NBA players or NFL players or whomever, because they have not responded to that in the same way they responded to Eric Garner in that situation. And very plausibly, it could be because it doesn't impact them personally in the same way that something involving a man and his wife who are racist against African Americans impacts them very directly.
Totally could. Yeah.
Is it incumbent on these NBA players or NFL players or professional athletes generally to do something or say something about all of the injustices? Or is it true that what Charles Barkley said is, I'm not a role model and they're not supposed to be role models? Which of the two? What is our reasonable expectation of these professional athletes?
I think they have to be role models, and I think that that's something that really needs to get more into sports. They're not perfect human beings by any means, but I think what they say has more weight in society, unfortunately or fortunately, than what like a prominent politician might say or people in other walks of life might have to say. So I would like to see more of a role model responsibility angle developing within, especially with some of the big stars that we have in the league who have this international image nowadays. I think it's really important to maintain some sense of morality and some sense of social responsibility in sports.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that they inevitably are benefiting from making millions of dollars because they are public figures.
Hmm.
And it's not, the talents that they have are incredible. They aren't necessarily improving humanity in any substantive way. They just happen to be very good at very particular things that are very entertaining, and we all wish that we could do, but that doesn't make
Right.
them necessarily improvers of our society. But that said, what does it say about us that we have such low expectations of politicians who, in theory, are actually shaping the world around us, or at least the government around us, and uh, how many schools we have in a certain area, how much funding these schools get. We have basically no expectations or reasonable expectations for them to be decent human beings,
Hmm.
realistically, and yet
Hmm.
we're trying to hold NBA athletes or NFL athletes to the standard. Is that fair to the athletes? Is it just because it's an oversight on us as a society and the way we evaluate politicians? Is it all the above? I don't know. What are your thoughts on it?
They're more exposed. Athletes are just so much more exposed than politicians could ever imagine being. I mean, unless you're the president or like in some sort of high rank within your own state, there's just so much more exposure, and there's just so much more of revenue and just so much more of everything than you could ever imagine in the political scene. And sometimes you look at a franchise like the Clippers, and I think how they handled the Sterling thing is excellent. And that type of accountability within an organization is really difficult to find in businesses or politics, other institutions these days. So I think it's part of the society we live in, and it's sort of with our exposure, like how much we grant them exposure and how much the media follows them around all the time. It's just the way it's done. And you talk about kids and like elementary schools now, like they all want to be athletes, and I don't think you would find that in other cultures in other countries because they don't have the same like ESPN, they don't have that same idea, I would say, in many other places. There are like two or three ESPN networks, and then Fox Sports doing a 24-hour thing. Like, we're obsessed with sports in this country. We are. I think we always have been. It's difficult to break that.
I wonder if we don't have comparable fascination with sports figures in other countries. It's just that we have very particular sports that we're interested in. But I have to imagine that a David Beckham is fascinating to people all across Europe, all across South America, probably even all across Asia. I mean, Bend It Like
Mm-hmm.
Beckham starred an Indian British
Mm-hmm.
woman who was
Mm-hmm.
fascinated with David Beckham.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know why she would be fascinated with an athlete who happened to have a really, really high register for his voice. I don't know what's alluring about that, but hey, David Beckham has turned that into making millions and millions, and he really only came to the U.S. because, for as famous as he was abroad, he could still make hundreds of millions of dollars here in the U.S.
Right.
without having to be quite as athletic as he once was. His
Mm-hmm.
skills had diminished, and so having diminished in ability, he just came to the U.S. where he sort of had an impact as a soccer player, but whether he had any long-term effects on the U.S. soccer, I'm not totally convinced, but I've heard arguments to the contrary. But regardless, I think that other countries do have fascinations with sports. It might manifest itself differently. I
I
can't
don't think
imagine.
they're linked to morality as much. Like we all look to, or the media looks to, like LeBron or like Peyton Manning sometimes for that feedback on social issues, and I'm not sure if it's the same way with like Ronaldo or David Beckham or some of the international stars that we have. Maybe the countries are smarter. They know not to look for moral opinions, facts, and stuff from athletes. But I don't know. I can't really say. At least in Korea, they're not looked to for moral wisdom. They're athletes. They're there for entertainment, and that's pretty much it.
Sure. And well, I think it's interesting you talk about Korea in particular. I can't really speak to the culture there, but I do think that it's interesting that we as a society are looking to athletes to uh, to discern what morality is in the world around us, especially given that, and I don't mean to detract from athletes in any objective sense, but so many of these athletes, like in basketball, they're the one and done athletes. They're the folks who spurned uh, academic institutions after a single year because they weren't really interested in being well informed in that way. That's not to say that they can't be well informed moving forward or that all of them are like that, but we're talking about a LeBron James who only went to high school. He didn't pursue a college degree. So how much do we have to take his influence in stride as well? Whatever he says, he might be right, he might be wrong, but he's also a guy who didn't develop his critical thinking skills in the same way. Now, he still obviously has critical thinking skills on the court, and he has an NBA IQ, a basketball IQ, above and beyond pretty much everybody else in the entire planet. But for some reason, we still would look for him to be as excellent in other areas of life because he happens to be public. And I wonder how fair that is for him, but also what it says about us as a society.
Yeah, I don't really know. It's life here, unfortunately, and I don't really have anything more than that to say. Jordan had to deal with the same things, and I think athletes and superstars throughout generations in the U.S. are, because they're so public, they're just there every night when you come home and flip on the TV. So that link between social responsibility and athletics, I just think is part of life in the United States in a very different way than it is in other parts of the world.
Well, you mentioned Jordan. I think he in particular represents something that has shifted over the last 20 years, because when it comes to LeBron has taken a stand, and Derrick Rose has taken a stand, and a number of them have taken a stand, especially after the Eric Garner case. But Michael Jeffrey Jordan was very particular about trying not to alienate everybody because, as he said, quote, Republicans buy shoes too. And he was more conscientious of promoting his brand rather than trying to get involved in something as messy as politics. So we may look to them for insight into morality, but they have not until relatively recently tried to be those leaders, I think, or at least not as actively try to be those leaders. Maybe that's because we live in the world of Twitter and we live in social media generally, and they can broadcast those opinions immediately, although those can be dangerous for them too. But something seems to have shifted in the last 20 years because the number one athlete in a sport, LeBron James, is taking a more active role now. And he also was active with the Trayvon Martin situation, which was at least arguably more ambiguous than, for example, Eric Garner. They are caught on video. It's really hard to be on both sides of that situation. Although
of course.
People do present both sides. But with the Trayvon Martin thing and wearing the hoodie and things like that, he has been more involved, and he deserves praise for being vocal, at least, about those kinds of things, knowing that it could impact his brand. Although fundamentally, it doesn't seem like it has impacted his brand negatively.
No. I don't think it would either. I mean, he's always going to sell shoes and clothes. Like, it's just not. It's not going to change things.
Right. You have any thoughts on the playoffs? Who do you think is going to win it all?
I really want my Celtics to get the 8th seed. I really hope they get the 8th seed in the East. I think it's going to be Cleveland and either San Antonio or Golden State in the finals. San Antonio is coming on strong near the end, and I was thinking when Cleveland's gelling that nobody's really going to be able to beat them unless Derrick Rose comes back for Chicago. I think Cleveland's going to run away with the East. I don't see anyone who can stop them at the moment.
I think Atlanta still has a chance. Obviously, they have a better record, and they seem to.
They do, yeah, but just like picking Atlanta, I can't bring myself to do it. Like, I just can't do it, and I don't know why that is. It would just be so against the script, against everything that this season has been about in the NBA. If they somehow manage to get to the finals, that would be mind blowing. And yeah, I just can't picture an Atlanta Golden State or Atlanta San Antonio final.
It would be difficult to envision it for sure. I would say it's possible, and they probably have to play perfect ball for it to happen.
They would, yeah, they would.
But I think it's possible. Look, I'm a Bulls fan. Of course, I'm going to hope for the Chicago Bulls to do well, especially because if they don't, this could be the end of the Tom Thibodeau era, and I don't think
Mm-hmm.
that's the thing that should happen. I think he should
Right,
be
right, right.
around, but
Yeah.
I hope Derrick Rose comes back and makes an impact. But we'll see. We'll see what steps in front of the freight train that is the Cleveland Cavaliers and LeBron
Mm-hmm.
James and all of that. And at least as far as the West, and the Warriors look fantastic.
They do. They look really, really good.
The Spurs
But
look
I
like the
think
Spurs
it's
again, but man, the Warriors. Whew.
the West has so much more room for parity though than the East
Yeah,
can. Like the East, you got Cleveland, you got Chicago, you got Atlanta. It'll come down to one of those three. The West, I really don't know. I could see a number of teams making it out of there. I think all 8 teams have a shot in the West. I really do. I think all those 8 teams can beat any of the other 8 teams any night. The issue is doing it over a 7 game series. That becomes a
sure.
problem. But the East is very weak this year.
Yeah, I don't know for sure if the Thunder are still in the eighth seed in the West.
Right, yeah, yeah.
I think if they make it, they're probably screwed. I mean, of the 8 teams that'll probably make the playoffs in the West, I think the Thunder, as fantastic, as phenomenal as Russell Westbrook is, it seems like the rest of his team is injured,
Yeah, absolutely.
and or they refuse to play defense, aka,
Right,
or Steve for reference, Enes Kanter absolutely just
right,
does not care about playing defense. So,
right.
especially against a team like Golden State, okay, they'll let Golden State score 150 points a game in the playoffs if they just choose not to play defense like that. And good luck, Russell Westbrook having a 150-point game.
Mm-hmm.
But all right, that I think about wraps it up. Thank you, Joe, for coming on the pod. Do you have any?
Thanks for having me.
Do you have any? You don't have a Twitter handle or anything like that, right?
No, I don't have a Twitter handle. I'm trying to get away from social media.
All right. Well,
Too many people are looking to me for moral authority. I gotta get out of it. I do want to go to China to get my own musical, so be on the lookout for that. The next time I'm on this pod, I might be promoting a musical in China.
will it be called Vatican Assassin?
It might have to be. I don't know what else it could be called at the moment, but that might be in the works. So check that out next time I'm on the pod. It might be a Chinese musical I'm promoting.
All right, perfect. Thank you all for listening.
Uh,
Hit me up on Amoral Action on Twitter or amoralaction@gmail.com. And remember, every action is a moral action.
Pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, exactly.
Everywhere. So, yeah.
All right, later.